Henry Goldberg was born in 1948 in Landsberg, Germany, in an American-ran displaced persons camp. His parents, Felix and Bluma Goldberg, were Holocaust survivors. In 1949, as a small child, he and his parents immigrated to the United States. There, they made Columbia, South Carolina their home, where his dad got a job as a janitor in a towel store. In 1970, Henry graduated from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's degree in business administration. Soon after he graduated, he enlisted in the South Carolina's Air National Guard at McEntire Air National Guard Base and served from 1970 to 1976. In 1972, he married Gloria Goldberg and later had two sons, Jason and Adam. The Goldbergs have 3 grandchildren. Henry worked for his father at the Towel Center for 12 years before starting the Palmetto Towel Distributors, in which he continues to serve as its president today. Henry is a strong supporter of the Jewish community. He served in the board of directors for Beth Shalom Synagogue, served 2 terms as president of the Columbia Jewish Community Center, as well as president of the Columbia Jewish Foundation, and was a former board of trustees member of the Central Carolina Community Foundation. Henry continues to help people become more knowledgeable about Holocaust history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Goldberg.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear? Thanks for the nice introduction. I'm going to give a talk that's formerly my mother's talk. My mother's a survivor, and she gave this talk for a long time. But she's 93 now and not able, so she lets me do it. So I'm going to give it in the first person, like she was speaking. I'm going to speak as if it were she speaking. By the way, there's some pictures if y'all are interested on that table out there. A family and an uncle with tattoos, etc. If you have any interest. But this is my mom talking now. Dear faculty and students, thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I hope that you might gain something from my words that will enhance your learning and your studies about the Holocaust. I shall never forget the day in April 1945 when a tall, blonde, tearful American soldier came up to me at the Kaufering concentration camp and said, "We're going to take care of you now." It was a day of which I had almost been afraid to dream for the last 6 years. I cannot describe the feeling I had and have about this unknown man and the American Army who were going to give me a chance to live. To this day, I wish I knew the soldier's name. In pre-war Europe, we had a beautiful family. We were young, happy, and had an almost carefree life in our small town of Pinchev, Poland. My dad, Haskell, was a leather merchant. He was fairly religious. Mother, her name was Rachel, kept the home for the family as mothers did. I was 13 when the Nazis arrived in our town. My sister Sella was 15. Our little sisters were Sala, who was 8, and the baby Yentala, who was an adorable 6. Kalma, for whom my son Carl is named, my brother, was our 17-year-old only brother. He was the apple of everyone's eye, so tall and slim and good-looking. Genya at 19 was our family beauty with light hair, very green eyes, a beautiful figure, and a movie star type mole on her cheek. We were Jewish in a Catholic country. Life was not easy, but we were typical and had that strong sense of fortitude that young people have. Then Hitler's Nazis came. Our town was too small to have a ghetto, so they just burned most of it. Our sister Genya was married and had a baby. She and her husband and child went to live and hide in the cellar of her burned-out house. After a period of living with such a strong smell of smoke, her husband contracted typhoid fever and died in what was left of our hospital. The Germans ruled. Right away, as you know, all Jews were forced to wear yellow armbands with a Star of David to separate us from the rest of the population. If a Jew was caught not wearing it, he or she was shot on the spot. My sister Sella, who survived the war and came with me to the U.S., always said that when she went out here, she sometimes still thought she had to remember her armband. The Nazis would shoot and kill. They were not human. Earlier, we had heard that the Germans wanted us all wiped out, but who could believe it? I was 13 years old. From the beginning, they would shoot about 5 people a day, always our community's best. Always it was our most educated, our professionals, and our intelligentsia. They did away with our leaders to prevent a possible uprising. They were always in those Nazi uniforms, with a show of strength in groups in the middle of town. Never did one see a lone Nazi near the edge of town. They had some fear. Conditions worsened. It was Rosh Hashanah. My dad left the house, I think, to go look for a new hiding place. The Nazis rushed in. Mother told Sella and me to run and hide in the woods. We were screaming and crying, and we said that was impossible. We could never leave the family. Mother stuffed all of the family money in Sella's pocket and pushed us out of the house. We ran into the woods, and we never saw our family again. It was an amazing thing. Can you imagine the Chinese or the Russians coming to Florence, burning our houses and businesses, or Nazis rushing into the school with guns, and all the students having to run into the woods for their lives? To be humiliated and tortured and starved for years with no hope of salvation. We think it impossible today. But here came the Germans, the most, quote, cultured, educated, sophisticated, and philosophic people of Europe. We lived in the woods. Winter was fast approaching. The weather grew colder and colder. Finally, we found 2 cousins and an uncle in the forest. Sella and our cousins would sneak to nearby villages and buy bread with the money that Mother had given us. After several months of hiding, the full force of winter had come. We knew that we could not survive in the forest. We made our way to the outskirts of a town called Chmelnyk. We had an uncle there. He was a carpenter and had a shop. We found that the Nazis had not sent him off to a camp because they could use him to build for the war effort. We went there and hid behind his stacks of lumber for several days. Finally, the SS men came looking for us. Some Poles had seen us and given us away. Twice they came looking for us around the shop and did not find us. We were realizing that this situation could not last. Then we heard announcements through megaphones that any Jews hiding could come to meet a truck the next day and be taken to a work camp. We had by now heard about the final solution, Treblinka and Auschwitz. We realized, though, that we had no choice. We made for the truck. As it turned out, this time the Nazis were telling the truth. We were taken to Hassag, a work camp, which was an ammunition factory. Our barracks had wooden slats on the floor with straw in them for beds. For sleeping, there was no more space than a body would take up. There was certainly no room to roll over. Every day we had to be in formation at 5 a.m. to be counted. The Germans were fastidious about their records. During the counting, if someone appeared to be too old or too young to work, they would be shot or sent to Treblinka, a death camp. If one were alone, that is, no family there, he or she would meet with the same fate. There was some strength in numbers. One night, while working at my ammunition machine, I was more tired than usual. I was fighting sleep. I let my eyes close for a couple of seconds. I was awakened by a vicious Nazi slap on the face. I never made that mistake again. While at the camp, I did receive the honor a couple of times to be allowed to clean the Germans' offices. For that, I was given an extra piece of bread each time. There at the work camp, we toiled as slaves for the Nazis, 12-hour shifts, whether it be day or night, freezing cold, the devil standing over you at all times. A 15-year-old little girl with no parents, no experience, and no sanitation anywhere. There was no hope for the ending of the war, certainly no hope of a defeat for the Germans, only the solace of having my big sister there, knowing that we would die together. What had happened to the world? What had happened to my beautiful family? My carefree beginnings of adolescence, could I ever dream of liberation? That a tall American soldier would one day call me out of the barracks with tears streaming down his face and ask about my history and welfare. Assure me that I was going to be taken care of from now on. It was the furthest thing from my mind. The only question was whether I should follow my instinct for self-preservation or go the easier route and allow the Nazis to end the misery quickly. By our will and the grace of God, we worked and survived in the work camp for 3 years. We worked on machines that made ammunition. Eventually, the Russians started to close in from the east. The Germans responded by bringing us west to the dreaded Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was not a work camp, it was a death camp. Not that there were crematoria there weren't. It was just a place to go to die. Upon arrival, we saw the people with that skeletal look, the gaunt look of starvation and death. After we got through the entrance there, a woman of the camp saw us coming in. She saw that we were in relatively good condition compared to the inmates there. Now it was January in Germany. The ice on the ground didn't melt until May. The woman had a heavy coat. She offered it to us in exchange for our ration of a slice of bread. Being wary, it seemed like such a ridiculous exchange, too good to be true. I turned it down. Regardless, after processing at Bergen-Belsen, they took all of our remaining possessions. They did give us a real shower and the close haircut that you have seen in the documentaries. They did give us a real shower and, we were issued the striped prison dress. After the shower, they separated those that appeared healthy compared to those that were sick or weak. I do not have to tell you what happened to those that did not pass the test. My sister and I were sent to the barracks, which consisted of a cabin with straw on the floor. There was no running water or toilet. Again, only room enough for a body to lie down. Our day consisted of arising before dawn for roll call formation, a breakfast of a piece of bread and lukewarm coffee, moving heavy debris such as tree trunks back and forth all day with no lunch, then a supper of warm water with a cabbage leaf. The next day, we would do it again and again while more and more people dropped and died. There was not much reason to try. At the very same time, Anne Frank, who was in Bergen-Belsen as well, met her fate. Finally, the Germans moved us to Burgau, a camp where we helped to build airplanes. Then they moved my sister and me again and again until we came to a camp called Kaufering. This was a camp where one's only goal was to have an existence. I had been very sick with typhus. My sister Sella had been able to help me with some of her food rations. Now she had typhoid fever and was gravely ill. I took a terrible chance and sneaked into the kitchen and brought her some food. By then, the risk really didn't matter. We didn't care. I was barely holding on. Finally, we heard guns. They were coming closer and closer. There was fire in the woods. Our people were just dropping like flies. Then there was no food, not even for the Germans. We were lying there sick and dying. Then we saw an American soldier in the doorway. This is the man of whom I spoke. He called me out and spoke to a few of the girls. I wish today that I knew his name. My sister and I knew we were free, but it didn't matter. We weren't even hungry anymore. Even those who weren't sick had no change of expression. We both were skin and bones. We were taken to a hospital and began to be nursed back to health. Only then did we cry. Only then did the feelings come. Only then did we find out that we were the only ones in the family that had survived, and that our dear father and cherished brother had joined the partisans and were killed just a few months before the war ended. After our recovery, we were placed in a displaced persons camp, which was funded by the Red Cross in Hyas. While there, we met our husbands-to-be, David and Felix, and we began our trip on a road to normal lives. All along the way, we were helped by Jewish agencies. 75 years have passed since the bittersweet day that the American soldier delivered the first act of kindness from the time the war began. Today, I stand before you as a citizen of this wonderful country that liberated me. I remain forever grateful to those American soldiers who risked their lives in order to deliver our freedom. So I say to you, young people today, love your brother and your sister. Stay close to your families and places of worship. Live your religions. Take a stand against injustice. Appreciate and be thankful for this most wonderful country in which we live. The USA afforded my dearly beloved husband, Felix, and I the opportunity to have happy, successful lives here. For the greatest part of the liberated Jews, there was no ecstasy. We had lost our families and our homes. We had no place to go, nobody to hug. Nobody was waiting for us. We had been liberated from death and the fear of death, but we were not free from the fear of life. As I close, I challenge you with a quest to extinguish all forms of hatred in the earliest stages. Hopefully, this wonderful country and world in which we live will continue to learn from its past mistakes. May God bless America. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing that with us. I will now be introducing Ms. Teese. Dr. T. Stephens has more than 32 years of nursing experience in both clinical and academic settings. She is an associate professor at the Medical University of South Carolina and is the author of Stephens' Model of Resilience and the founder of RNPREP, which stands for Personal Resilience Enhancement Plan. Her work is focused on resilience, specifically as a tool to address and prevent burnout in clinicians. Thank you. Much of her work in resilience is built upon the narratives of Holocaust survivors. Dr. Stephens is recognized as a leader in nursing education and research, specifically in the areas of workplace culture, faculty development, student success and engagement, and best practices in online learning. She is a certified nurse educator and an active member of several professional organizations, including Sigma Theta Tau, NLN, ANA, and SNRS. She serves on the advisory board for the Vantage Point Foundation and the Holocaust Education Film Foundation, and is a member of various task forces and work groups, and serves as a nursing education consultant for NurseStem Incorporation. She received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from East Tennessee State University, her Master's of Science in Nursing from King College, a Postmaster's Certificate in Nursing Education from the University of Tennessee, and her Doctor of Philosophy in Nursing from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Stephens is the author of several publications and book chapters, and she is a frequent presenter at regional, national, and international conferences and workshops. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Stephens.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor. It's going to be really hard to follow that. That was wonderful, and it's an honor to hear your mother's story. I think, am I supposed to show, did you tell me to show some slides before I go to mine? Or no? Okay, I'm sorry. I want to apologize for my voice. I have lots of cough drops on hand. My voice has been back for 2 days, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it will stay during this. The title of what I'm going to talk about is Holocaust Whispers, Lessons in Resilience, and that's the name of a course I developed, and then a few other side things along the way. And I'm not Jewish. I'll explain a little bit of how I came to work with Holocaust survivors and how this became such a huge part of my life. But I'm very casual. If you have any questions, please stop me. So this was me in 1986 as a brand new nurse, and I entered the workforce. My background, as she said, I've been a nurse for now 33 years, but the first 20 plus years I was in practice, mostly in the emergency department, and I was a trauma nurse. But when I first entered the workforce, I recognized that the culture was not exactly what I had expected it to be. And so at that point, I made myself a promise that if I was ever able to make a difference for other new nurses, that I would do what I could to change that. I didn't know what it was called or what the problem was, but I knew that there was a problem. And then advance, a few years, and I started as an administrator. I was looking at the high rates of attrition in nurses, and you all probably, anybody in here in the healthcare professions? Anybody? No? Okay, you are. So we have a real problem with attrition rates, especially with nurses. And so I was a hospital administrator and very interested in that. And looking at those that did not leave, they were described as resilient over and over again. And I wanted to know, what does that actually mean? Is it something that can be taught? Can we learn to be resilient? Or is it just something that comes naturally to people? And so that led me to talking to different individuals who were considered to be highly resilient. So I was working at that time with a group of students and orphans in Haiti. The children that I was working with were called Restabecs. They were children who had been trafficked into the sex industry or the slave industry after the earthquake. And I was talking with some other people, too, who had gone through extreme forms of tragedy. But I also started talking to Holocaust survivors. I mentioned that I'm not Jewish, but I had a strong, my mother was very, very much involved in the Jewish community and was one of the founding members of the museum in Chicago. And so I had been around some survivors and had grown up hearing the stories of survivors and the things that had happened in the Holocaust. So I was still in Tennessee and began working with the Tennessee Holocaust Commission just to learn more about it myself. And I became introduced to several survivors through that endeavor, and it just took on a life of its own. While I'm not Jewish, I am Christian, but while I'm not Jewish, they welcome me into their lives, both here in the United States and in Poland, and it has become uniquely special to me. It's not just part of my work anymore. The slide at the beginning said, remember. It's become my personal mission. The more I learned about it and the more I experienced of their stories, the more important I felt it became that I be part of that we never forget what happened. And so it's just been a natural evolution that it's part of my work now. That as I talk to clinicians across the United States about preventing burnout, I use these stories to talk about resilience and what these people did and how they lived their lives and what we can learn from them. And it's a way of sharing these stories and these narratives, hoping, and praying that this is never repeated again and that we learn from this experience. So these are some of the people who have become like my family and have given their time and energy to me, and I am very, very grateful to them for sharing of their stories. They're all have unique stories of their own. These were all survivors, and they were in different camps, but they have willingly shared their stories, and they asked me to share them for them now if they are unable to do so. And it is an honor to do that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what their stories have done to inform my work as a scientist, as a researcher, and what I'm doing in the healthcare community. And I know it seems a bit of a stretch. Sometimes people tell me, now, how do you connect the stories of Holocaust survivors with, physician and nurse burnout? And I say we learn from them. What they did during the worst time, the most horrible things that we can imagine happening to someone, we can learn from them. I call them the resilient superheroes. I mean, they really are. They are unique. I'm sure if I were to talk to your mother or talk to you about your mother, there would be some very unique characteristics about her. They are different. And they were different often before they went into the camps. But it just strengthened during that experience, and they came out, and there's so much that we can learn just from what they did to survive. So this is in Auschwitz, and I took this picture a couple of years ago when I was there visiting the camps and doing some interviews. But as you know, this is where selection took place. This is just as they were coming in on the train. And I stood there on the tracks, and a lot of the pictures you're going to see as I'm going through this, I took on the different experiences that I had there. But I have this hanging in my office just as a reminder to me that, I've been given the opportunity to share this story, and I hope that you will take what you learned tonight and other things too and continue to share too. I think it's our responsibility to do that. So the work that I have done in studying resilience and how do we become more resilient, which is not the ability to bounce back is what we used to call it, bouncing back, but we know now that resilience actually means that we are at an improved state, that because of adversity or trials that we're different afterwards, and it's really what happens in that process, but we come out different than we were before, and hopefully get stronger and better because of the experience. And what I've found from the narratives of the different survivors that I've worked with and their stories, both alive and posthumously, because I've used a lot of diaries from Holocaust survivors, from those that have passed on, but I've gone back and gotten their writings and looked at what they wrote in the camps, and we've transcribed some of those and looked at those through a research lens. We've come to call the 4 Ps of resilience. And that's purpose, priorities, perspective, and personal responsibility. And as you spoke about and read your mom's story, I picked up on all 4 of these in her story. And it's across the board. I see it almost every time that I talk to them. These things they're displayed uniquely in each person's story because everyone's experiences were different. But all of these things come through. And that's been one of the things that has really spoken to me throughout this process. So priorities really is about what matters to you. What are your values? And we see that highly resilient individuals, especially these survivors, they had a deep sense of their values. And, in Mr. Goldberg's relating his story of his mom, you could probably sense what some of her values were. Her faith, her family, those things. We picked up on and we've learned that highly resilient individuals have a very outward mindset. They're concerned about others and about doing what's right and a deep sense of justice. And they're committed to their values. We compare that to the people who were considered as bystanders or collaborators, and they were much more swayed by other people's values. They were willing to be swayed or to follow orders and to do things because they didn't have that deep sense. So one of the things we talk about in the workshops and helping people to become more resilient is to really know who you are and what you believe in and what you stand for. It requires some choices sometimes to do that, but all of these individuals had a very deep sense of what they believed was right and wrong and what their personal values were and their ethics. You saw in the film that was shown at the beginning, was that the Guardian, was that film from The Guardian? When the Red Cross came in and liberated some of the camps in Auschwitz, this photograph was taken from the children's area where Dr. Mendeley was doing the experiments. And I had hosted a 3-month tour of the Deadly Medicine exhibit where we talked about the experiments that were done on twins and on children and on different people that they were using in the name of medical science. But these were 2 twin little girls. You probably have heard of Eva Kors. She died, I think, about a year ago. But this is her and her sister, Marion. And they were 2 of the children that were part of Mengelé's experiments. And I had a chance to interview Eva several times, and much like Mr. Goldberg's mother's story here, her priorities were very much focused on a sister, on someone else. She was willing to take chances. She was willing, like your mother was, to risk her own life for someone else. And this is uniquely different in a lot of these highly resilient individuals. They are very much, their priorities are outward focused. They care about others, and they want to help them, and they're willing to take risks for them and to help other people. So priorities are very much outwardly focused. So one of the things that we do is we talk about what matters to you and why does it matter, and really knowing that about yourself, and it really inspires you to take a different mindset during times of adversity. I took this photograph. One of the survivors that I work with is the youngest survivor from the Terezin concentration camp, Teresa Stephens, which is in the Czech Republic, just outside of Prague. Have any of you all been there? Okay. And so this was where a lot of the children went, and it was used as a propaganda station when they were invited. There was a lot of word getting out in the U.S. and in other countries about what was going on, or rumors were going on. And so they were wanting someone to go in there and inspect to see what was actually happening. And so the International Red Cross had asked if they could come in and inspect the camps. And you all can read about this. If you go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website and just type in Terezin, Terezin, you can get the full story. But Inga was there, and what they did was they prepared the camp to actually represent more of a spa-like place than what it actually was, so that the inspectors would come in and give a good report and leave. And so I went to visit this camp. Inga had asked me to visit her bunk where she had stayed for all those years. And so I went and took some pictures, and I went into, this was one of the processing rooms, and they allowed me to stay in there for a little while. But this is where, when they would first get to the camp, they would process them. And this is what it looked like. So most of the people were given 24 hours or less before they were taken to either the ghetto or the camps, depending on where they were. And most of the ones that I work with were actually in the Warsaw area, so they went to the Warsaw ghetto. But Inga was not. She was in the Czech Republic. But they were told, to take what you can carry. And so people packed literally everything that they could into these suitcases. The children usually used pillowcases or something like that if they were given that opportunity. Your mother didn't have that opportunity because she escaped and ran into the woods, which is the story of many. But if they knew they were being taken somewhere else, especially on the train transports, this is what they did. And so I stood there and I took this photograph of some of the suitcases, and I thought, if I were to leave and I were to be going somewhere and I didn't know if I was coming back and I didn't know where I was going and I was told to pack something up, what would I take with me? And I asked that of people in the workshops and in my classes, what would you take? What if it wasn't just what you could carry? What would you take with you if you were limited to 5 things, and that could be people or items? And you had to choose those things, what would you take? And that really gives you a good sense of what your priorities are. And to be able to, what I do when I'm talking with clinicians, it's one of the ways that we avoid burnout, because we allow things that aren't our priorities to take over our mind and our energy. And we become so stressed about things that aren't truly our priorities. And so that's one of the things that highly resilient individuals, these survivors, did. They knew what their priorities were. They knew what mattered to them. And so that's the first P, is priorities. And what matters to you matters. It really does. And it's something that we try to be cognizant of and remind people of. And I use these stories to relate that. The second P is purpose. And that's why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? Now, there's the big P purpose, like why are we here? The big philosophical question, why were we born? And my son is a theoretical physicist. So we have some really interesting questions about why are we here. He's also in seminary on top of that, so those conversations get extremely interesting. So we talk about the big P, the big purpose, why are we here? But there's also the purpose of why are we here right now? What are we to learn from this experience? And what are we to do in this moment? And if you really think about that, we can find purpose in just about everything that happens to us if we think that way. Highly resilient individuals were able to identify purpose and were to reframe situations in a way that was very unique to them. Any of you read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? He was a Holocaust survivor. He was a physician, a psychiatrist that was in the camps. He lost his wife and his daughter in the camps, and he came out and wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. It's really been foundational to my work. I read it once a year. It's a phenomenal book, and this is one of his quotes. And meaning is purpose. And he says, everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life. Everyone must carry out a concrete assignment that demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is unique as his specific opportunity to implement it. We all are here for different reasons, and we all have different opportunities in fulfilling that purpose. I imagine your mother's, if we were to go back and ask her at that time what she felt like her purpose was, it would be similar to what a lot of the other survivors was in helping her sister to remain alive.
Story I'll tell you maybe later.
Yeah, good. And it almost always it was about someone else. One of my best friends had two sons. She lost both of them within a span of 2 years. One, he was a senior. His senior year of high school, he was the captain of the football team, and he died during the initial kickoff. 2 years later, her older son committed suicide. She lost both, the only two children she had. And when we were going through that process together with her and her husband, her purpose was in the morning, she had to make a decision, do I get up or do I end my life too? And her purpose was her dog. She said, if I don't get up, my dog will die. And for that moment, that's what it was, and she looked outward. And so we find that people who are in extreme forms like what your mother was in, the will to live comes from somewhere deep inside, and almost always it's about someone else. Either getting back, the survivors were wanting to get back to someone else, or to find out if someone was still alive. Or in the case of some of the ones that I work with, they knew that someone that they were with in the camp wouldn't survive without their help. And so that will to live is a phenomenal thing when we think about that. Once they gave it up, they became what's called in the literature the Musliman. If you all read about that, it's where they were, the Walking Dead is essentially what that refers to. And they died usually within 2 to 3 days after they became like that. It was like a walking corpse. This is another one of Viktor Frankl's quotes that I love. Oh no, it's the same one, sorry. But that's where finding your why, in the moment or the big why, and focusing on that, especially during times of extreme adversity. This is another one of his quotes. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. And he really struggled after the war when he was liberated with, why do I even go on now? I've lost everything. There's no one left. Why was I left behind? He had a lot of survivor's guilt, but also what am I supposed to do with that? And he found his purpose in that, in writing the book and telling the story so that it's never repeated again. That became his purpose. The third P is perspective. How do we look at the situation? And the survivors had a very unique way of looking at the situation. In highly resilient individuals, we measure resilience in a very interesting way. There are things that resilient individuals that possess that we call protective factors. And these are the things that buffer or mitigate the effects of stress. And we actually measure these in people when we're doing a study. And perspective is one of those. And it's a way they maintain perspective in horrible situations. Humor is one of those. Faith, social support or family support, flexibility, the ability to adapt, All of these things are coping mechanisms, things that they use. And perspective goes hand in hand with those things. And so it's how do you look at an adverse situation? Do you just fall apart and say, I give up, or do you persevere and go on? Do you try to find meaning in that? Are you able to adapt? I'm sure your mother adapted to many things. It sounds like she had an amazing life pre-war, and that was the case. They were completely dehumanized. And that was the goal, was to make them less than human. That's why the names were erased, and they were in Auschwitz, at least, were given the tattoos. They wanted to they shaved their heads. And when you look at the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials, and I've read through a lot of those, the guards, when they were really questioned, those that were still alive, about how were you able to do these atrocities to these humans, they didn't see them anymore as human. The lack of hygiene was part of that. The starvation, they didn't look human. And so they dehumanized them to the point that they justified what they were doing to them. How do you maintain perspective in something like that? Well, they're very intelligent often. They're very smart. They're thinkers. They are able to think through things, and somehow they maintain who they are in the midst of that. They recognize it over and over again. When I'm talking to the survivors, they are able to recognize that they're not the same as those perpetrators were, that they were different, and that even though they were treated as less than animals, that their behavior was at a higher ethical standard than those that were standing in front of them, well-fed, clean, and in much better health, that they were doing what was right and what they believed was right. But this is how we see such a difference in them with the perspective. And we talk about reframing our own perspective, but that outward mindset is also very important. And then personal responsibility. Almost all of them felt a responsibility to someone else beyond just themselves. They weren't just living for themselves. It was a responsibility towards others, towards justice, towards doing what was right. And those that have lived and are still alive now have given just about everything to tell this story and to make sure no one forgets. And so that's become their purpose. Personal responsibility is about accountability. And this photo I took in the same camp in Terezin, and I told you a little bit about how it was the time it was made to be a propaganda station, and they were bringing in the Red Cross. So they cleaned up the camp, and they sent, because most of the camp residents at that time were in very, very poor health. They weren't as bad as what in Auschwitz or Birkenau were, but they were starved, they were unclean, they didn't look healthy. So they sent them to the gas chambers, and then brought in a healthier bunch from some of the ghettos to make it look like that they were being well taken care of. And when they brought the Red Cross, the International Red Cross inspectors through the camp, this was one of the places that they had on display for them to visit. And so this is me standing in the middle of the room. The other side of the room is an exact replica of this. So there was both walls along the laboratory were with sinks, okay? And they had another room that had toilets in it too. I didn't take a photo of that, but lined with sinks, and you can see the mirrors are still up there. They're not in good shape now, but the mirrors are still there. So when they brought the inspectors in, they told them, look here, we are taking great care of them. We have these sinks. They have a place to clean up, to maintain proper hygiene. We even give them mirrors. And, they're standing there, and they're impressed with that, and they walked out of the room. Not one of them went over and inspected. If they had, they would have found out there was no plumbing. Nothing was even hooked up. It was all a facade. And the results of that lack of responsibility on those individuals to inspect that camp, they failed in that over and over again. They left the camp, wrote a good report about what was going on. The residents were all taken to the gas chambers following their visit. So I also have this photo. that if we are given a responsibility towards others, we are responsible for their behaviors. And that's part of what I have done with the stories that I have been given. I consider it my own responsibility to share those because they're not mine to keep any longer once I have those. I'm finishing up. I'm sure my time is, I'm sorry. So personal responsibility is about doing what is right. And how do you define that? How do you define what is right? And a lot of what we talk about in that we've learned from the transcripts from the trials and looking at what happened after the war, after the liberation, and when we really started finding out and all of the documents that came of what went on in there, and looking at leadership and the things that happened. And this is Rudolf Hess, who I'm sure many of you have heard about. He was kind of Hitler's right-hand person, who closest to Hitler, and one of the most savage perpetrators in the camps, and responsible for many of the deaths that occurred there. The other gentleman is in complete contrast is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a theologian and a philosopher. He was not Jewish, but he was hung as a result of his work in defiance of the Nazis in Germany. And so both of these, if you look at their writings, they said they had no choice in what they did. Bonhoeffer was following his faith and his value system that he had to speak out against what was going on, even at the risk of his own life. Hess said he had no choice but to follow orders, and that was the excuse that he gave during the Nuremberg trials. So personal responsibility is recognizing there's always a choice in what we do, and that it can go either way. If you're interested in more about the perpetrators, collaborators, and bystanders, there's a really great course that is called Echoes and Reflections. And I teach that course occasionally, but it's all available online, and you can just search that. But you can see all of these individual stories as well as some of the footage from the Nuremberg trials. I'm just going to close with these last few quotes. And this, again, is at the train station in Auschwitz when they first arrived, and they were going to be either sent to the left or sent to the right. And I think this is a quote that, as Monday is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's usually on the 27th. To remember, it didn't start with gas chambers. It started with politicians dividing the people with us versus them. It started with intolerance and hate speech, and when people stopped caring and became desensitized and turned a blind eye. And then one of the most famous survivors of all is Elie Wiesel. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor and never the tormented. And I think we're going to answer questions now, right? Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm not sure where you want me to go with the...
Can I get a second to this? I got a little response.
Yes, please do. Come up here.
I'm sorry.
No, I'd love for you to do that.
This is exactly what you were talking about. One about resilience. One's kind of lighthearted, actually, maybe it'll help, and one about the will to live. My dad is also a survivor, and he was in the death march at the end of the war, walking through the snow, through the woods toward Berlin, and they passed a potato farm. And the Nazis told them they could actually go through the farm and get one potato, and eat it. But if anybody went through the line more than once, then they would be shot. And so Dad's thinking, he said, well, I'm not going to make it anyway, so I might as well die on a full stomach. So he went through 6 times. And he didn't get caught, but he had the will to live.
Yeah.
On a lighter note, after the war ended and Dad and Mom were in this displaced persons camp where they met, Dad somehow came out with, he was aggressive, and he was quite resilient. You'll find out in a second. He had a camera, and someone introduced him to Mom, and she said, will you please take my picture? And he said, yeah, and he did, and he got it developed and took it to her, and she said, thank you. How much do I owe you? And he said, nothing, how about just a kiss? And she, can I have a kiss? And she said no. And so then he kissed her anyway. And then she slapped his face. And then they started going out and they got married. And, I mean, but that was resilience from Dad's part, I thought. He wouldn't take no for an answer.
Overwhelmingly, they have these wicked senses of humor. And we find that, that's a protective factor, the ability to laugh. And then also just, a lot of times they're very courageous. They do things that others would not have done.
He wouldn't take no.
Yeah. One of the survivors that I work with, her tattoo is smeared. And I asked her about that, why, the numbers are not very clear. And she was just a child at the time that they were tattooing her. And she said, I bit him. And she said, I was not going to just stand there and let him do that to me. And she was a little spitfire, still is. But yeah, there's very unique characteristics. Thank you for telling that. I love that. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you to you both for your presentations. We're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. Are there any questions from the audience at this time? Okay, let me come on.
Sorry. I talk pretty loud.
Video.
I have a question for you, Mr. Henry, right? So you said both of your parents are survivors, correct?
Yeah.
It was Felix and Bluma.
Yeah.
Can you talk about which camps they ended up at during their time during the Holocaust?
Well, it was, Dad had a long story. It would take a lot longer time to tell his story, which is why I didn't. But he was actually, in 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, they were both from Poland. They were overrun in 3 weeks. But Dad was drafted into the Polish army. And so they went backwards for 3 weeks, and then that was it. But then they were taken to a work camp, and after that, the Germans separated the Jews from the rest of the population. And then he said it hit the fan then. But he went to a number of camps, but he was in Auschwitz for a couple of years. But he lucked out somehow. He got a job as an elevator operator, and so that was a little easier work, So things like that had to happen for you to make it, But he ended up in Buchenwald at the very end of the war, and everybody was skeletons, skin and bones when they heard the fighting in the woods, and the Nazis yelled for everybody to come out. They were going to kill everybody. But Dad hid under the barracks, and he said to himself, "Self, I'm not coming out, no matter how much they call me." And they called for 2 or 3 days, and they never checked him, and that's one way he made it. Everybody who survived had stories like that. Something unusual. He just sort of quick-witted, I guess. I could go on and on. You want to hear another story?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know. This is about an American soldier. In the Battle of the Bulge in 45, when the Americans, it was winter, we weren't doing too well, and we had a group of soldiers who were surrounded by the Germans and finally found the need to surrender. And they surrendered to the Germans, and we didn't have anybody above the rank of sergeant. And the Germans called them in formation and said to the highest ranking sergeant, said, "Give me all your Jews. Tell me which ones are yours are Jewish." And the sergeant said, "We're all Jewish." And so the Nazi says, "You don't understand." And he pulls out a gun and puts it to the sergeant's head. And he says, "I need your Jews. And if you don't give them to me, I'm going to shoot you in the head right now, and you'll be dead." And this sergeant in the U.S. Army had the presence of mind to say, he said, "You can do that, but this war is going to be over in 2 or 3 months. And if you do it, they're going to be war crimes trials, and they're going to find out, and you're going to be a dead man." And the Nazi dropped his gun and didn't do anything. There's a book out now about this sergeant's
You're not going to
son.
believe this.
He's from Tennessee.
He's in my hometown. In Tennessee.
I stole
yeah.
your thunder then.
No, that's just awesome that you did
Okay,
that. That's
yeah.
wonderful.
There is a
Yeah.
book about it.
It's from my hometown.
I think the book's called No Surrender.
Yes, it is.
So, I'm
He was
sorry.
actually named, no, I'm glad you brought that. I wouldn't have shared that, but he was actually one of the people that was named the right,
One of the right in Israel.
yeah, in Israel, righteous among the nations, or something like, it's a title that they give non-Jews who acted and at great sacrifice to help the Jews.
Yeah, the same guy that made the movie about, what was his name? He's in one of the.
Oh,
I can't remember.
Schindler.
Schindler.
Yes. He was righteous among, I'm sorry, my mind is escaping me. Any other day, I would be able to tell you what that was, but.
Something about righteous
Yes.
Gentiles.
Yes, Yad Vashem, you can go to their website, it lists all of those.
So, anyway, good question.
Yeah, very good.
Any other questions from the audience?
This is probably a weird question, but I've heard from other stories that sometimes there was like moments of laughter or happiness or something that pulled them through. Did your parents ever mention like a moment like she had with her sister or just anything that finding light in the darkest time kind of
Is there
thing?
ever a time that humor pulled them through a really rough time, like moments of laughter or lightheartedness that got them through something?
I never heard about that. You know, Dad was a pretty tough guy. He wasn't a big guy, but he was pretty tough. And I grew up hearing screaming at night, you know, nightmares and stuff. But he was a happy-go-lucky kind of guy. He was always happy. And here's how he was. One night I came over to his house, and I was depressed. I was down. I said, Dad, business is not good, you know, this guy beat me out of money, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do here. And he looked at me, and he said, what's the matter with you? You know, I said, what? He said, don't you have a nice house? You have nice cars? Everybody's healthy? Nobody's shooting at you because you're a Jew? You know, straighten up, you know. I said, God, Dad, you're right, you know. That's how it was.
That's perspective. There's one of the diaries that I did a study on. We actually used it to look at the signs of resilience in this one person diary. His name was Odd Nansen, and he was a Norwegian political prisoner. And so he had, because he was a political prisoner, he had a little bit more privileges than some of the others. You know, he was able to receive occasional Red Cross packages, and his wife was able to come occasionally. And those people were able a little bit more to maintain a sense of humor because they were in better health. You know, you get to this point and everything's gone from you, and you know, you're just surviving. All the emotions are numb a lot of times. But in the diary, there was a lot of times that humor brought them through because he would make fun of the guards, and they would joke about them behind their backs, and they would make up these fictional lives for the guards. I mean, some really bizarre things that they did, but it got them through. You know, the beatings, after a beating, they would come back and share what they were thinking about, you know, and it was, crass humor, but it got them through, and that's how they survived, and they were able to laugh and found some sort of support with each other in doing that.
Teresa, I actually have a question for you. In your presentation, you talked a little bit about politics playing a role in having control or wanting control. Can you talk a little bit more about that topic, and do you see any similarities in the political scene today?
Hola, yeah. Yeah, and it's, this has been, probably for me personally, the aspect of blind following and blind loyalty willful blindness in a lot of times has been one of the concepts that has come out the strongest for me in how it determines outcomes. And the power that has over humans. I see there's huge connections in all aspects of life. Now, it's not at the level of the atrocities that we saw here, but it can become that way. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so committed to this, because you see, Mr. Goldberg mentioned, the Germans at that time were considered, at the pinnacle of intellect, accomplishments. They were not animals, they were highly accomplished, very intelligent, but they did these atrocities. So it's in us to do these things. And the fact that many of these were family men, they had wives, they had children, they had people that came and supported them during the trials that told of all their wonderful characteristics, but yet they did these things. And every time it came out that they were able to justify their actions because they were following orders. And when we talk about values and priorities, that was higher to them than any other value. They really believed they were doing what was right by following the orders of a maniac, a narcissist. And so they went to their deaths saying that. Whether inside they believed that still or not, they were able, like Hess was in the transcripts, he said, I know what happened was wrong, but I had to do what I was told to do. No, he didn't. It would have come at a great cost to him, just like it did these other people to say no and not to go along with that. And so I do a lot of leadership classes and I do a lot of training in leadership, and that's where we see things go wrong so many times, is people not willing to stand up and speak out, even if it's against a superior. And it's because of fear of retaliation or not being seen that way. And I talk about compassionate courage. There's a way we can do that. And in healthcare, that's something we have a real problem with because it's a very hierarchical structure. And we see that in politics and in other places where people willingly sacrifice their own values for someone else's for place or position or title. And bad things happen when that happens.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question?
You did. You
Okay.
did. Okay, got a question?
Thank you both for sharing your insights. Very valuable and important message to be told. Where do you see those in this room and elsewhere making a difference? I mean, Zahor, remember, yes, the need is to remember, to tell the story, and to communicate to those that have maybe not so much knowledge. There are a lot of Holocaust deniers out there. And there's a nice small group here, but what can we do individually and or as a group to make a difference that it does not get forgotten?
For me, it has been taking advantage of opportunities such as this. One thing is participating and coming to these things. If you see a Holocaust survivor is going to be somewhere or a family member, go to it. Take someone with you. Tell about it. Support those efforts. Visit the Holocaust Museum. Anytime I'm in another city and for speaking or wherever, I always find out. I was just in Portland. There's a Holocaust. I go there and I support those things and I tell other people. Social media is a very powerful way of sharing information. I use my own platforms that way, especially around events like this and Holocaust Remembrance Day, to put it out there, the information. Because there's, like you said, there's a lot of deniers, but there's also a lot of people who just have no clue what went on. And I go into, this is a calling for me. I don't get paid to do these things. I do this all on the side of my regular job. And so what I do is I go to, anytime someone asks me to come speak at a middle school, a high school, wherever that is, if I can go, I go, because they have no idea what this is. And so I consider it my personal responsibility, and maybe I have more opportunities than somebody else to share these stories, but I brought it into my life and into my work, and I share it that way. And I think any way that you can can find ways to share the stories of their information, and it's unique to everyone else. I give books. Some of the survivors that I work with have written books. I give copies of the poems to people. Anything that I can do. I mean, your mother's story, hopefully it's been published. If it hasn't, we'll talk about that.
That's a good website.
Okay. Sharing that, telling people about it. I think word of mouth is great. And when I did the Deadly Medicine exhibit 2 or 3 years ago, I had it for 3 months. We just told everybody we could, and they were bringing busloads of people from all over, children, high school students, and many of them had said, we've never even had a class on this. Thankfully, I think South Carolina now, it's part of the curriculum. In most states, but we were about to lose that in many states. So just advocating for that and being an advocate and a voice, I think. Is there anything else that you would?
Thank you so much. We got time for one more question. Is there one more question from the audience?
I was looking at the pictures you have up here. Could you talk a little bit about what their life was together? Because it looked, is that you in the picture with the baby?
That's not, the baby in that is me. Yeah. That was taken in Germany. We had this American displaced persons camp, that was nursing the prisoners back to health. And Dad and Mom met there. They were introduced by somebody else. That's when the camera story came up. And so I was born there in a Catholic hospital. The nuns there made Mom her first dress out of some curtains they had in the hospital.
Does she still have that?
I don't know. I don't know. They were going to, after they were in that camp, Dad had 2 brothers to survive, and they went to Israel, then Palestine. And Dad and Mom both sent their stuff to Israel, and they were planning to come, and then Mom heard a rumor that they could come to the U.S., and it turned out to be true, and they said they were going to come to Colombia, and they thought it was Colombia, South America, but they didn't care, and I was on that ship that we came through New Orleans and not through Ellis Island. And interestingly, recently we found the passenger manifests of the people that were on that ship that came from Germany. And the address for, my name's in there, my parents in there, and it had the destination address. And for hours it said 1413 Gervais Street, which is a major street in Columbia. But that actually was the address of the train station. We had no place to go, and so they wrote the address of the train station as our destination. But now I forgot your question. Okay.
Did you have a sponsor when you came? Did they have someone?
Hi, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the Jewish citizenship of Columbia helped us out.